He raised his staff. He swung it toward the sea, and the sea split in two. A wall of water on the left, a wall of water on the right, and a dry path in the middle, wide enough for hundreds of thousands of people to walk through. His name was Moses. He was saving his people from the most powerful empire on earth. And this miracle was not where the story begins.
To understand Moses, you have to understand the world he was born into. And the world he was born into was not meant for him. It was Egypt. Ancient Egypt. One of the most powerful civilizations that has ever existed on this earth. A civilization of towering stone monuments, of rivers that fed entire continents, of gods carved into cliff faces, and of a ruler who was considered not merely a king, but a living god himself. His name was Pharaoh. And Pharaoh was afraid. This is where the story begins. Not with miracles. Not with fire or sea or the voice of God in the wilderness. It begins with fear. Because fear is always where the darkest stories start. For generations, a people known as the Israelites had lived within the borders of Egypt. They had come there long ago, in a time of famine, following a man named Joseph, a story of its own, full of betrayal and dreams and divine intervention. But that story belongs to another night. What matters now is this. The Israelites had grown. Not in power. Not in wealth. They had grown in number. In presence. In the kind of quiet, undeniable weight that a people carries simply by existing in great numbers within a land that does not consider them its own. And Pharaoh noticed. He watched the Israelites multiply across his kingdom. And something cold moved through him. A calculation. A fear dressed in the language of national security, of political risk, of the ancient question that powerful men have always asked when they look at those they have kept beneath them. What if they rise? What if they decide that they are tired of building our monuments, carrying our stone, living under our rule? What if there are simply too many of them? And so Pharaoh made a decree. Quiet at first. Bureaucratic. The way the worst decisions in history always are. The Israelites would work. Harder than before. As slaves. Breaking stone under the Egyptian sun. Building cities they would never live in. Constructing monuments to a civilization that considered them less than human. But still they multiplied. And so Pharaoh made a second decree. This one was not quiet. Every male child born to an Israelite woman was to be thrown into the Nile. Let the river take them. Let the water do what the sword might make too visible, too brutal, too hard to explain to history. Drown them at birth. Before they can grow. Before they can think. Before they can become the thing that Pharaoh fears most. A generation of baby boys, sentenced to death before they had drawn their first breath of real air. And it was into this world, or in the middle of this darkness, that a woman gave birth to a son. His name, we are told, would eventually be Moses. But in the first moments of his life, he had no name that mattered to anyone but his mother. His mother looked at him the way mothers have always looked at newborn children, with a love so total and so immediate that it leaves no room for anything else. No room for fear. No room for the decree. No room for the river waiting outside. She hid him. For 3 months, she kept him hidden. In the most dangerous empire on earth, in a land where informants existed and neighbors talked and soldiers checked, and the punishment for defiance was not a fine or a warning but something final and irreversible, she hid her baby boy. For 3 months. And then she did something that sounds, on the surface, like an act of despair, but was, in truth, one of the most remarkable acts of faith ever recorded. She built a basket. Not a simple basket. She waterproofed it with tar and pitch, the way a boat hull is sealed against the sea. She made it as watertight as she could with the materials available to a woman with nothing. She lined it with cloth. She placed her son inside it. And she carried him to the Nile, the same river that Pharaoh had decreed would be his grave. She placed the basket at the edge of the reeds along the riverbank and let it go. And she stood there, watching it float away, with the specific, shattering grief of a mother who is doing the only thing left to do when every other option has been taken. She could not keep him. She could not protect him. She could not fight Pharaoh's army with her bare hands. But she could give him to the water. She could give him to something larger than herself. She could let go and trust that the river which was meant to be his death might instead become his passage to something else. His sister, Miriam, stayed close, watching from a distance, keeping the basket in sight as it drifted through the reeds. And then something happened that no one planned. No one arranged. No one could have predicted. The basket drifted directly into the path of a young woman who had come to bathe at the river's edge. A young woman attended by servants. A young woman whose presence at the Nile required no announcement, because everyone already knew who she was and stepped aside without being asked. She was the daughter of Pharaoh. She saw the basket in the reeds. She sent a servant to retrieve it. And when it was opened, the baby inside looked up at her. And he cried. The ancient texts say she felt compassion for him immediately. That something moved in her the moment she saw him. She understood what he was. She said so openly, without disgust or horror, "This is one of the Hebrew children." She knew exactly what her father's decree said. And she chose, in that moment, to ignore it. Miriam, watching from the reeds, stepped forward at exactly the right time. She approached the princess with a question so perfectly timed that it could only have been guided by something beyond ordinary instinct. "Shall I go and find a Hebrew woman to nurse the child for you?" The princess said yes. And Miriam went and brought the child's own mother. Pharaoh's daughter paid the mother of the child to nurse her own son. In the palace, under Pharaoh's roof, inside the walls of the most powerful man in the ancient world, the same man who had ordered every Hebrew baby boy to be drowned. His own grandson, by adoption, was now being raised at his table. The irony of this is almost too large to hold. When the boy was old enough, he was brought to the palace permanently. Pharaoh's daughter adopted him fully, raised him as her own son, gave him the name that history would carry for 3,000 years. Moses. And so the child who was supposed to die in the river grew up instead in the palace of the man who had tried to kill him. He was educated in the wisdom of Egypt, the most advanced civilization of the ancient world. He learned mathematics, astronomy, architecture, medicine, military strategy. He was surrounded by luxury, by power, by the very best that the ancient world could offer. And beneath it all, he carried something he could not quite name. A question that does not leave a person alone, no matter how comfortable the room they are sitting in. Who am I? The palace was beautiful. The food was extraordinary. The clothing was fine and the servants were many, and the view from the royal quarters looked out over a civilization that could build mountains from stone. But Moses was not Egyptian. And somewhere in the deepest part of him, he knew it. There came a day when that knowledge could no longer be contained. He went out among the people. He saw them working, his people, the Israelites, under the Egyptian sun, under the Egyptian whip. And he saw an Egyptian taskmaster strike a Hebrew man. Strike him the way you strike something you do not consider fully human. Moses looked one way, then the other, and then he did something that ended his life in the palace forever. He intervened, and in the intervention, the Egyptian was killed. Moses buried the body in the sand. He thought no one had seen, but someone had. And when Pharaoh heard of it, the verdict was immediate. Moses had to run. The Prince of Egypt, the adopted grandson of the most powerful man in the ancient world. The child who had floated down the Nile in a basket and been pulled from the water by a princess, was now a fugitive, running into the desert, alone, with nothing. And this was not the end of his story. This was only the beginning. The desert does things to a person. It strips away everything that is not essential. Everything that was given to you by civilization, by status, by the name other people called you. The desert has no interest in who you were in a palace. It has no interest in what you owned, what you wore, what language you spoke at dinner, or how many servants waited outside your door. The desert only knows what you are when everything else is taken away. Moses crossed into the land of Midian, a territory east of Egypt, on the far side of the Sinai Peninsula, where the land is dry and ancient and the sky at night is so full of stars that you understand, for the first time, why the people who lived there believed the heavens were alive. He sat down by a well. He was exhausted, alone, a man without a country, without a name that meant anything anymore, without a future he could see clearly from where he was sitting. And then, as so often happens in the stories of the ancient world, a group of women arrived. 7 daughters of a priest named Jethro, who had come to water their father's flock. But other shepherds were there too, and the other shepherds did what men with power have done throughout every era of human history. They pushed the women aside and took the water for their own animals first. Moses stood up, not because he had a plan, not because he calculated that this was a good moment to make an impression. He stood up because somewhere inside him, beneath the palace manners and the Egyptian education and the years of privilege, there was something that could not watch injustice happen and stay seated. He helped the women. He drove away the other shepherds. He watered their flock. When the daughters returned to their father and explained what had happened, Jethro asked a question that echoes across 3,000 years with the simplicity of wisdom. Where is he? Why have you left him? Invite him to eat. Moses stayed. He married one of Jethro's daughters, a woman named Zipporah. He became a shepherd, And for years, some accounts say 40 years, he lived this quiet, invisible life in the desert of Midian. The prince of Egypt became a keeper of sheep. The educated man of the palace became a man who knew the desert by the smell of its winds, who knew where water could be found in places that looked waterless, who learned the patience of the shepherd, the particular, bone-deep patience of a person who spends their days walking slowly behind animals across land that does not change quickly. It is worth pausing here, because what looks, on the surface, like the least dramatic part of Moses' story, is actually one of the most important. The 40 years in the desert were not wasted years. They were not a gap in the story, a pause before the real events began. They were the making of a man. The desert gave Moses something the palace never could: stillness, humility, the kind of knowledge that only comes from watching the same stars for 40 years and realizing, slowly, that you are very small, and the universe is very large, and something far greater than you is at work in the spaces between things. He was 80 years old, some accounts say, when it happened. 80 years old. Not a young man having a vision. Not an ambitious leader looking for a mission. A man who had lived most of a long life, who had failed magnificently, who had run from everything he knew, who had learned to be quiet in the desert. He was tending the flock near a mountain. The mountain was called Horeb, or Sinai. Different names in different texts for the same ancient place. A mountain in the wilderness that has drawn people to it for thousands of years, as though the rock itself holds something. And then Moses saw it. A bush. On fire. This alone would not be remarkable. Desert fires happen. Lightning strikes dry brush, and the brush burns. Moses had seen fire before, but this fire was not consuming the bush. The branches were not blackening. The leaves were not curling and falling as ash. The bush burned with a brightness that did not diminish, a heat that did not destroy. It simply burned. And from within the fire came a voice. The ancient texts do not describe the voice in terms of volume or sound. They do not say it was loud, or deep, or carried on the wind like thunder. They simply say it was there, present, unmistakable, a voice that knew his name before he spoke it. Moses. He stopped. He answered, "Here I am." What followed was a conversation that changed the course of human history. "Remove your sandals," the voice said, "for the place where you are standing is holy ground." Moses removed his sandals. The voice identified itself. "I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, of Isaac, of Jacob." And Moses hid his face. The texts say he was afraid to look at God. What the voice said next was not a gentle suggestion. It was not a request that could be declined. It was a statement of intent, spoken with the certainty of something that has already decided what is going to happen. "I have seen the suffering of my people. I have heard them crying out. I know their pain. And I have come down to rescue them, to bring them out of Egypt and into a land flowing with milk and honey." And then the moment that would define the next 40 years of Moses' life. "So I am sending you to Pharaoh. Go, bring my people out of Egypt." Moses was quiet. And then he said something remarkably human. Something that any honest person would say, standing barefoot in the desert at 80 years old, being told to go confront the most powerful ruler on earth. Who am I, or to do this? It is not false modesty. It is not performance. It is the real question of a real man who knows his own history, who knows he is a fugitive, who knows he has not spoken to power in 40 years, who knows that the last time he tried to intervene in an injustice, he ended up running for his life. Who am I? The voice did not argue with the question. It simply answered it with something more important than reassurance. I will be with you. Moses asked another question. What is your name? If the people ask who sent me, what do I tell them? And the answer that came back from within the burning bush is one of the most extraordinary statements in all of human literature. I am who I am. Tell them, I am has sent you. Not a name that can be held. Not a title that can be categorized. Not a label that fits within the language of human understanding. I am. The present tense. The eternal now. Being itself, speaking to a man standing barefoot on a mountain, through a fire that did not destroy what it touched. Moses had more questions. What if they don't believe me? What if they say I'm lying? The voice directed him to look at the staff in his hand. The simple wooden staff of a shepherd. Throw it on the ground. Moses threw it. The staff became a serpent. Moses ran from it. And then the voice told him to pick it up, to reach out and take hold of the serpent by its tail, the most dangerous way to hold a snake, the way that gives you the least control. He reached out. His hand closed around it. And it was a staff again. This is your sign, the voice said. This is what you will carry with you. Moses had one more objection. Perhaps the most honest one. I am not a good speaker. I have never been eloquent. I am slow of speech and slow of tongue. Some scholars have interpreted this as a speech impediment. Others as simple lack of confidence. But what matters is not the precise nature of the difficulty. What matters is the response. The voice did not say, "You are wrong. You are actually an excellent speaker." It said, "I made your mouth. I will be with your mouth. I will teach you what to say." And then, because Moses was still hesitating, his brother Aaron was given to him as a companion and a spokesman. Moses stood up. He picked up his staff. He went back to Jethro, asked permission to return to Egypt, gathered his wife and children, and began the long walk back toward the most powerful empire in the ancient world. Toward the man who had wanted him dead. Toward the people who had been waiting, in suffering, for someone to come. The shepherd was going home. And the world was about to change in ways no one could yet imagine. Moses returned to Egypt. Think about what that required. 40 years had passed since he had left. The Pharaoh who wanted him dead may or may not have been the same man on the throne now. History and scripture give different answers, and scholars have argued about the precise timeline for centuries. But the institution of Pharaoh remained. The power remained. The army, the monuments, the system of slavery, the absolute authority of a man who was worshipped as a god by the civilization he ruled. And into this walked an 80-year-old shepherd with a wooden staff. Moses and Aaron went to Pharaoh. They delivered the message clearly, without preamble, without diplomatic softening. "Let my people go." Pharaoh looked at them. And then he said something that powerful people have said to powerless people throughout the entire history of the world. "Who is your God, that I should listen to him? I do not know this God, and I will not let Israel go." He increased the workload of the Israelites instead. As a demonstration, as a reminder of who held the power in this particular conversation, Moses went back to the burning presence that had spoken to him on the mountain. He was discouraged. He said so honestly, and the answer he received was not a reprimand. It was a preparation. What followed was not a single dramatic confrontation. It was a process. A series of events so extraordinary, so precisely escalating in their severity, that the ancient world had nothing in its entire catalogue of natural or supernatural experience to compare them to. They are known as the 10 plagues of Egypt, and they deserve to be understood not simply as miracles, but as something far more deliberate and far more specific than that word usually suggests. Each plague was not random. Each one struck at the heart of something Egypt held sacred. Each one was, in its own way, a direct challenge to a specific Egyptian god, a statement, made through the physical world, that the power being demonstrated here was greater than anything Egypt had ever worshipped. The Nile turned to blood. The great river, the source of all Egyptian life, the reason civilizations could exist in the middle of a desert, the waterway worshipped through the god Hapi, turned red. The fish died. The water could not be drunk. The smell across the land was of death and rotting things. Pharaoh's magicians, we are told, were able to replicate this sign. They turned water to blood as well. And Pharaoh hardened his heart and would not listen. Then came the frogs. Frogs from the river, from the canals, from the ponds and the streams. They came in numbers that covered the land, into the houses, into the bedrooms, onto the beds, into the food, into the ovens. Everywhere. The frog was a sacred creature in Egypt, associated with the goddess Heket, the goddess of fertility and birth. Now the sacred animal swarmed in numbers so vast it became a plague of its own. Pharaoh called Moses. He asked him to pray that the frogs be removed, and promised that if they were, he would let the people go. Moses prayed. The frogs died. The land stank of rotting amphibians piled in great heaps in the fields and the streets. And Pharaoh saw that the crisis had passed. And he changed his mind. This pattern, the suffering, the promise, the relief, the broken word, would repeat itself with a terrible, almost rhythmic consistency throughout what followed. The dust of the earth became gnats, insects so small they filled the air and crawled into eyes and mouths and ears across the entire country. Pharaoh's magicians attempted to replicate this and could not. They said to Pharaoh, quietly, with the professional honesty of men who know when they are looking at something beyond their understanding, "This is the finger of God." Pharaoh did not listen. Then came the flies. Thick swarms of them, covering everything, filling every space, but, the texts note specifically, not touching the land where the Israelites lived. A boundary existed. A distinction was being made visible in the physical world. Then disease struck the Egyptian livestock. The horses, the donkeys, the camels, the cattle, the sheep. They died. But the livestock of the Israelites did not die. Pharaoh sent people to check, we are told. Every single animal of Israel was alive. He still would not let them go. Then Moses took handfuls of ash from a furnace and threw it into the air before Pharaoh. And it became fine dust that spread across the entire land of Egypt, and wherever it landed, it caused boils. Painful, festering, inflamed sores on the skin of every Egyptian and every Egyptian animal. The magicians could not even stand before Moses, the texts say, because of the boils. Still, Pharaoh would not listen. Hail fell from a sky that had not seen weather like this. Not in any living memory. Not in any recorded history. Thunder, lightning, and hailstones so large they destroyed everything in the open fields, crops, trees, animals, and any person who had not heeded the warning to take shelter inside. The flax and the barley were ruined. The wheat and the spelt, which were later in season, survived. Locusts came next. A wind from the east brought them in numbers that covered the face of the ground and devoured every remaining plant that the hail had left. Every tree, every crop, everything that grew, eaten. The land had never seen anything like it, Pharaoh's officials told him. They had never seen it in the memory of their fathers' fathers. And the 9th plague is perhaps the most eerie of all. Darkness. Not the ordinary darkness of night, which you can move through, which passes, which has stars in it and ends with morning. This was a darkness that could be felt. A thick, physical, absolute darkness that settled over Egypt for 3 days. People could not see each other. They could not move. They stayed where they were, in the dark, unable to go anywhere or do anything, simply existing in a darkness that pressed against them like a weight. But in the places where the Israelites lived, there was light. 9 plagues. 9 demonstrations of power that escalated from the uncomfortable to the catastrophic. 9 times Pharaoh said yes, and then no. 9 times the pattern repeated. And now came the 10th. This one was different from all the others. This one was not announced as a natural phenomenon to be witnessed. This one was quiet. And it was personal. And it was final. Moses delivered the warning with the directness of a man who has been through this cycle enough times to have no softness left for it. At midnight, every firstborn son in Egypt will die. From the firstborn of Pharaoh who sits on his throne, to the firstborn of the slave woman. And among the livestock as well. The Israelites were given specific instructions. They were to take a lamb, sacrifice it, and mark their doorposts with its blood. They were to eat a specific meal, dressed and ready to travel, sandals on, staff in hand. They were to eat quickly, because when this night was over, they needed to be ready to move. At midnight, the final plague moved through Egypt. The firstborn of every Egyptian household died that night, including the son of Pharaoh. There was a great cry across Egypt. The texts say it was the kind of sound that a nation makes when it is broken, when it has nothing left to harden itself with, when even the most powerful man in the world looks at the body of his child and understands, perhaps for the first time, that he is not a god. Pharaoh called for Moses and Aaron in the night, and this time there was no negotiation, no conditions, no promise that would later be broken. He said, "Get out. Take your people. Take everything. And go." And that night, the Israelites left Egypt. All of them. After 400 years. After generations of slavery, of broken backs and stolen children and lives lived under someone else's power. They walked out. Into the night. Into the desert. Towards something they could not yet see. They moved at night, first. Hundreds of thousands of people walking out of Egypt in the dark, carrying everything they could carry, moving faster than a crowd of that size should have been able to move, driven by something that is difficult to name precisely, not panic exactly, and not quite joy, but something in between. The feeling of a door being opened that has been locked for 400 years. The texts describe a pillar of cloud that led them by day, and a pillar of fire that led them by night. Something visible. Something that moved ahead of them and said, without words, "This way. Keep walking. Follow this." Ancient descriptions of this have been interpreted in many ways over the centuries. A volcanic plume, some researchers have suggested. An atmospheric phenomenon. A spiritual presence made physical. The honest answer is that no one knows exactly what it looked like from the outside, or what anyone would have seen if they had been watching from a distance. But those who were there followed it. And then, several days into the journey, something changed in Egypt. Pharaoh's grief was real. The loss of his son was real. But grief, in powerful men, does not always produce wisdom. Sometimes it produces something else entirely. Pharaoh changed his mind. Again. He looked at the empty city, at the vacant labor camps, at the suddenly silent building sites, and perhaps the economic reality of what he had just released hit him alongside the grief. 400 years of unpaid labor, walking away into the desert. He assembled his army. 600 of his best chariots, plus all the other chariots of Egypt. His officers, his cavalry, his soldiers. He went after them. The Israelites looked up from their camp and saw the dust on the horizon. And then they looked ahead and saw the water. They were trapped. The sea before them. The army behind them. Mountains and wilderness on either side. There was no way out that human calculation could find. The panic that rose through that crowd must have been total. The texts record the complaints directed at Moses with an honesty that does not soften them. Why did you bring us out here to die in the desert? Were there not enough graves in Egypt? We told you to leave us alone. We would rather have lived as slaves than die like this. This is what fear does to people. Even people who have witnessed 9 impossible things. Even people who have seen the most powerful empire on earth brought to its knees over the course of months. Fear has a short memory, and in the face of cavalry and chariots and an ocean, the memory gets even shorter. Moses said something to the crowd that day. Simple. Direct. The kind of thing that can only be said by a person who has already moved through their own fear to the other side of it. Do not be afraid. Stand firm. And watch. The pillar of cloud that had been leading them moved. It relocated to behind them, between the Israelite camp and the approaching Egyptian army. Creating, the texts say, a barrier. Darkness on one side. Light on the other. The Egyptians could not advance through the night. And Moses stretched out his staff over the sea. A strong east wind began to blow. It blew all night, and the sea parted. The waters divided, pulled back on either side and stood as walls, walls of water, held in place by something that defies the ordinary behavior of physics as we understand it. A path opened across the sea floor, dry ground where there had been water, stretching from one shore to the other. The Israelites walked through, all of them, in the dark, between walls of water that had no business standing where they stood, walking on ground that had been beneath the sea hours before, moving through the middle of something that should not have been possible. The Egyptian army followed. They drove their chariots onto the sea floor, between the walls of water. And as they moved into the passage, their chariot wheels began to come off. The ground that had been firm beneath hundreds of thousands of walking people became soft and unstable under the weight of metal and horses and military equipment. The army was confused, disorganized, trapped on a path that was no longer cooperating with them. And then Moses stretched out his hand again, and the walls of water came back. The sea returned to its full depth. The Egyptian army, the 600 chosen chariots, the officers, the cavalry, all of it, was caught in the return of the water. Not one of them survived. The texts say that the next morning, the Israelites looked out at the shore and saw the bodies of the Egyptian soldiers washed up on the beach. And they understood, perhaps for the first time in the totality of the experience, that what had just happened to them was not going to be undone. They were free. And then the singing began. Moses sang. His sister Miriam took a tambourine and led the women in a song that has survived, largely intact, for 3,000 years, considered by many scholars to be one of the oldest pieces of recorded poetry in human history. Sing to the Lord, for he is highly exalted. The horse and rider he has hurled into the sea. They sang on the shore of a sea that had just swallowed an army. And then they turned and walked into the desert. Because freedom, it turns out, is not a destination. It is the beginning of a journey. And this journey had 40 years left in it. The desert of Sinai is not a place that makes life easy. It is hot by day and cold by night. Water is scarce and unpredictable. Food does not grow in the quantities that hundreds of thousands of people require. And the people who had just been liberated from the most powerful empire in the ancient world began to complain about the food. This is not a criticism. It is, again, simply human. Hunger is real. Thirst is real. And when you are moving across an enormous, unfamiliar desert with your children and your elderly and your animals, the theological significance of your recent liberation is somewhat harder to hold onto than the physical reality of your empty stomach. Food appeared. Quails came in the evening, covering the camp. And in the morning, when the dew lifted from the ground, there was something left behind. A fine, flake-like substance, white, thin, lying on the desert floor like frost. The people looked at it and asked each other, "What is it?" The word they used for "what is it," in Hebrew, manhu, became the name. Manna. It fell every morning for 40 years. The people were told to gather only what they needed for that day. If they gathered extra and tried to keep it overnight, it rotted and smelled. Except on the 6th day, they were to gather double, because the seventh day was to be a day of rest, and the manna would keep overnight on that day alone. A system, a rhythm, a daily act of trust that what you needed would be there when you needed it, but that you could not stockpile it, could not control it, could not make yourself independent of the source by accumulating more than your share. Then came the mountain. 3 months after leaving Egypt, the Israelites camped at the base of Mount Sinai, the same mountain where Moses had seen the burning bush, the same ground where, barefoot and alone, he had heard a voice from within a fire. But this time, it was not just Moses. Moses went up the mountain. And what happened there, across multiple encounters, across what the texts describe as 40 days and 40 nights on the mountain, was the giving of the law, the covenant, the framework for how a freed people would live, how they would treat each other, how they would organize justice and community and relationship with the divine. 10 commandments, given on stone tablets. Instructions for worship, for social order, for the treatment of the poor and the stranger and the person who has less power than you. The ancient world was full of legal codes. The code of Hammurabi, the laws of various Egyptian dynasties, the regulations of Mesopotamian city-states. What distinguished what was given on Sinai was not simply its content, though the content has shaped Western civilization more profoundly than almost any other document in history. What distinguished it was its basis. This law was not given by a king to serve the interests of his kingdom. It was not designed to protect the property of the powerful. It was given to a people who had just been slaves. And it began with a reminder of that. I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery. Before any commandment, before any requirement, before any obligation was placed on anyone. A statement of what had already been done. Moses came down from the mountain. He found the camp in chaos. In the 40 days he had been gone, the people, unable to see him, uncertain whether he was coming back, frightened by the thunder and fire visible on the mountain above them, had done something that broke every instruction they had been given. They had melted their gold jewelry into the shape of a calf. And they were worshipping it. Moses broke the stone tablets when he saw it. The tablets on which the commandments had been written by, the texts say, the finger of God, shattered on the ground at the foot of the mountain. What followed was a reckoning. Consequences. The particular pain of a people who had been given everything and immediately turned away from it. And then Moses went back up the mountain. And the commandments were given again. This is worth noticing. The second giving. The willingness of the divine to try again with a people who had already failed. To rewrite what had been broken. To not end the story at the first catastrophic mistake. The 40 years in the desert were not a punishment, exactly. They were more like a formation. A generation was let go, the generation that had been born in slavery, whose minds had been shaped by the experience of being owned. A new generation grew up in the desert. A generation that had never known Egypt. A generation that knew only the manna in the morning and the pillar of fire at night and the laws given on the mountain. Moses led them through all of it. Through the complaints and the rebellions and the moments of collective fear and the moments of extraordinary faith. Through water from a rock and bread from the ground and the slow, long education of an entire people in how to be free. And at the end of it, he climbed a mountain. Mount Nebo. He was 120 years old, the texts say. And his eyes were not weak, and his strength had not diminished, which is itself a remarkable detail. From the top of the mountain, he looked out. He could see it, the land that had been promised, the destination that had been the point of all of it, the Exodus, the desert, the lore, the 40 years. He could see it spread out below him, full of life, full of everything that the desert was not. He would not enter it. The reasons given in the texts are complex and have been debated for centuries. The simplest reading is that the generation that had left Egypt was not the generation that would arrive. Moses belonged to the old world. What came next required new eyes. He stood on the mountain, and he died there. The texts say that God buried him, that no one knows exactly where his grave is to this day, that no prophet had arisen in Israel like Moses, a man who had known God face to face, a child in a basket on a river, a prince who did not belong in the palace, a murderer who became a shepherd who spoke with fire, a man who stood between a terrified nation and the sea that divided before his staff, a leader who carried 400 years of inherited grief across a desert for 40 years and handed it, at the very end, to the people it had always been meant for. And then he climbed his mountain, and the story continued without him, as all the greatest stories do. Rest now. The desert is quiet. The sea has long since returned to its depth. And somewhere, under a sky more full of stars than you have ever seen, the manna is already falling. Softly, slowly, just enough for tomorrow. Close your eyes. You are safe. And the morning is not far.